It's 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November 2016, and Pastor Rick Henderson sits alone in his Nashville megachurch office, staring at his phone. The sanctuary that holds 3,000 people will be half empty this Sunday. It was full just 5 years ago. His adult children haven't been to church in 3 years. One of them texted him earlier that night, "Dad, I still love Jesus. I just can't do this anymore." Rick doesn't know it yet, but he's witnessing the beginning of the end of an era that defined American culture for nearly a century. And here's the thing that should terrify anyone who cares about understanding American culture. We can pinpoint the exact moment this collapse began. Not the year, not the month, the actual moment. And it wasn't what anyone expected. The Bible Belt's death didn't start with a scandal. It didn't start with politics or culture wars or even the internet, though those accelerated everything. It started on a random afternoon in 2009 in the most unlikely place imaginable, the office of a mid-level executive at a company most Americans had never heard of. But before we get there, you need to understand what actually died, because it wasn't Christianity. It was something far more specific, far more American, and far stranger than you realize. Picture the American South in 1995. The Scopes trial is underway in Dayton, Tennessee. A high school teacher named John Scopes is being prosecuted for teaching evolution. William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate, faces off against Clarence Darrow in what newspapers call the trial of the century. Here's what most people miss. Bryan won. Scopes was found guilty. Tennessee's anti-evolution law stood for another 42 years. But something else happened in Dayton that summer that actually mattered more. H.L. Mencken, a Baltimore journalist covering the trial, coined a term that would echo through history. He called the region the Bible Belt, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. He was mocking what he saw as backward fundamentalism. But the religious communities he mocked, they wore that label as a badge of honor. They built an empire on it. By 1950, the Bible Belt wasn't just a geographic region. It was a cultural fortress stretching from Virginia to Texas, encompassing 15 states and over 60 million people. It had its own economy built on church construction, Christian publishing, and revival circuits. It had its own politics, its own music, its own education system. Billy Graham could fill a stadium in any Bible Belt city with 72 hours' notice. Church attendance in these states hovered between 73 and 81%. For context, that's higher than church attendance in medieval Europe. In 1955, there were more Americans attending church on Sunday than there were watching television on Saturday night, and television was the newest, most addictive technology humanity had ever created. The system was self-reinforcing. You grew up going to church because your parents went to church because their parents went to church. You met your spouse at church. Your business connections came from church. Your social calendar revolved around Wednesday night services and Sunday potlucks. Leave the church? You weren't just leaving a religion. You were leaving your entire social world, your reputation, possibly your job. A 1963 study in Mississippi found that 78% of respondents said they would not hire someone who openly didn't attend church. Not wouldn't prefer to hire. Wouldn't hire, period. But here's where it gets interesting. The Bible Belt's power wasn't actually about faith. It was about information control, and I can prove it. In 1970, if you were a teenager growing up in a small town in Alabama or Arkansas or Oklahoma, your sources of information about the world were limited to exactly 5 channels. Your parents, your school, your church, your local newspaper, and maybe 3 television networks that all basically showed the same thing. If all 5 of those channels told you the same story about how the world worked, what the rules were, what was acceptable behavior, you had almost no access to alternative narratives. You could read books, sure, but which books? The ones at your local library curated by locals who shared the same worldview, or the ones at the bookstore in town, which stocked what would sell to the local population. This is why the satanic panic of the 1980s worked so well in Bible Belt communities. In 1983, a woman named Judith Hess appeared on 20 different Christian radio shows across the South, claiming that Procter & Gamble's logo was a satanic symbol, and that company executives had admitted on talk shows they donated profits to the Church of Satan. None of this was true, not even a little bit true, but it spread like wildfire because there was no easy way to fact-check it. By 1985, Procter & Gamble was receiving over 15,000 calls a month about this rumor. They eventually had to completely redesign their 103-year-old logo. The story persisted in some communities until the mid-1990s. Why? Information control. Let me give you another example that's even more specific. In 1987, youth pastors across the Bible Belt warned teenagers that if you played Stairway to Heaven backwards, you could hear satanic messages. Thousands of youth groups held record-burning events. Here's the fascinating part. To actually verify this claim, you needed access to a record player that could play backwards, a copy of Led Zeppelin IV, and either technical knowledge of audio equipment or friends who had different information. Most teenagers in Bible Belt communities in 1987 had none of these things, so the claim went largely unchallenged. The information environment was a closed loop. Now jump to 1995. The commercial internet exists, but it's clunky. You need a computer, which costs $2,000. You need a phone line, and your parents get mad when you tie it up. You need to know where to look for information, and search engines barely work. A kid in rural Tennessee in 1995 might have gotten an hour a week online, mostly in chat rooms with people from similar backgrounds. The information loop was cracking, but it hadn't broken. Welcome to Professor Archive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden mechanisms of cultural change, you've come to the right place. Quick question for you. Where in the world are you watching this from? And more importantly, what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how this story resonates across different time zones and cultures. And if this channel has value for you, if these investigations into historical moments matter to you, consider leaving a super thanks. It directly supports this kind of in-depth research. All right, back to the story, because we're about to get to the exact moment everything changed. June 29th, 2007, Cupertino, California. Steve Jobs walks onto a stage and holds up a device that looks like a piece of glass. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator, he says. Are you getting it? These are not three separate devices. This is one device. The iPhone? Here's what nobody realized at the time. Jobs hadn't just invented a phone. He'd invented a portable information liberation device. And over the next 24 months, this device would do something that no atheist organization, no court ruling, no cultural movement had been able to do in 80 years. It would shatter the information monopoly that held the Bible Belt together. But the iPhone itself wasn't the kill shot. It was the infrastructure that grew around it. And here's where we get to that executive I mentioned at the beginning. His name was Kevin Systrom. You've probably never heard of him, even though he changed your life. In October 2009, Systrom was working at a company called Nextstop, and he started playing around with coding in the evenings. He was interested in location-based check-ins like Foursquare, which was popular at the time. By early 2010, he'd created a prototype app called Bourbon. It had a lot of features, but one of them was photo sharing with filters. On March 5th, 2010, at approximately 2:30 p.m. Pacific Time, Systrom met with a colleague named Mike Krieger in a coffee shop in San Francisco. They looked at Bourbon together and realized it was too complicated, too many features. They decided to strip it down to just the photo sharing element. That decision, made in that coffee shop on that afternoon, was the moment. That was when the Bible Belt began to die, though nobody on Earth knew it yet. They renamed the app Instagram and launched it on October 6th, 2010. Within 2 hours, it had 10,000 users. Within 2 months, it had 1 million. But here's what's crucial. Instagram didn't just let you share photos. It let you see photos from anyone, anywhere, living any kind of life. And crucially, the algorithm didn't care about geography. A teenager in a town of 3,000 people in rural Georgia could follow people in New York, Los Angeles, London, Tokyo. Could see how they dressed, what they did on weekends, how they talked about relationships, what mattered to them. Now combine this with Facebook, which opened to everyone in 2006, and Twitter, which launched the same year, and YouTube, which started in 2005 but didn't become truly mobile-friendly until 2010. Suddenly, for the first time in human history, you had millions of young people in Bible Belt communities with instant, unlimited access to alternative narratives about how to live, what to believe, what was normal. And here's the key. It was all peer-to-peer. It wasn't authorities telling them what to think. It was people their own age, living lives that looked interesting, free, and happy. The data is absolutely stark. In 2007, 71% of Americans aged 18-29 in Bible Belt states identified as Christian. By 2012, just 5 years later, that number had dropped to 58%. That's a 13-point drop in 5 years. For context, from 1990 to 2007, 17 years, it had dropped only 7 points. The rate of decline doubled, then tripled. By 2021, only 49% of young adults in Bible Belt states identified as Christian. For the first time in recorded American history, being Christian was a minority position among young people, even in the heartland of American Christianity. But church attendance is where you really see the collapse. In 2008, 42% of Americans attended church weekly. By 2020, that number was 29%. But those are national numbers. In Bible Belt states specifically, the collapse was even more dramatic. Alabama went from 61% weekly attendance in 2008 to 37% in 2020. Mississippi, the most religious state in America, went from 63% to 41%. These aren't gentle declines, these are free falls. And here's the most telling statistic: the age gap. In 2008, there was an 11-point difference in church attendance between Americans over 50 and Americans under 30. By 2020, that gap was 34 points. Entire generations were abandoning the system simultaneously. Churches that had been pillars of their communities for 100 years suddenly couldn't pay their mortgages. By 2019, between 6,000 and 10,000 Protestant churches were closing every year in the United States, most of them in Bible Belt states. Now, you might be thinking correlation isn't causation. Maybe smartphones didn't cause this. Maybe it was politics or scandals or changing attitudes about sexuality. And yes, those factors mattered. But here's how we know the information environment was the primary driver: the geographic pattern of decline. The decline wasn't uniform across the Bible Belt. It was sharpest in areas where smartphone adoption was fastest. Rural areas with poor internet connectivity? Slower decline. Suburban areas with excellent 4G coverage? Precipitous drops. The pattern follows the infrastructure rollout almost perfectly. There's a researcher named Derek Thompson at The Atlantic who tracked this in 2019. He found that in counties where smartphone penetration exceeded 70% by 2014, church attendance among young people dropped by an average of 23% by 2018. In counties where smartphone penetration stayed below 50% during that same period, church attendance dropped by only 9%. Same time period, same demographic, different outcomes based entirely on access to information technology. But let's talk about what this actually looked like on the ground, because statistics don't capture the human experience. In 2015, a youth pastor in Arkansas named Daniel Harris noticed something strange. His youth group had 75 kids in it in 2012. By 2015, it was down to 40. He started asking the kids who left why they'd stopped coming. The number one answer, repeated almost word for word by dozens of teenagers: it just doesn't seem real anymore. When he pressed them on what changed, they talk about YouTubers they watched, podcasts they listened to, Instagram accounts they followed. One girl told him, "I spent my whole life being told the world worked one way, and then I got on TikTok and saw it works completely different." Here's a specific example that got documented. In 2016, a teenage girl in Tennessee named Sarah posted a question on Reddit. "I was taught that living together before marriage leads to divorce and unhappiness. But I follow like 200 people on Instagram, and most of them live with their partners and seem really happy. Were my parents lying to me?" That post got 11,000 responses. Hundreds of people shared data showing that the correlation between cohabitation and divorce is actually largely explained by other factors like education level and age at marriage. Sarah had been told her entire life by sources she trusted that cohabitation was a guarantee of future misery. The internet showed her, with receipts, that this wasn't true. Now, multiply that experience by millions of teenagers asking similar questions. Does God really hate gay people? Well, I follow several gay couples on YouTube and they seem normal and happy. Is evolution really a lie? Well, I just watched a 40-minute video by a biologist who explained the entire fossil record. Do I really need church to be a good person? Well, I know dozens of atheists online who volunteer and donate to charity. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Bible Belt didn't just lose the information war, it lost the narrative war. For decades, the story told in Bible Belt communities was, we are normal, and the outside world is strange, dangerous, and unhappy. The internet flipped that script. Suddenly, Bible Belt teenagers could see that people in other places thought their communities were the strange ones. They could see polls showing that America was rapidly becoming less religious. They could see that most developed countries were largely secular and seemed to be doing fine, actually. There's a psychological term for what happened: pluralistic ignorance. It's when everyone in a group privately doubts the group's beliefs but thinks everyone else believes, so they stay quiet. Bible Belt churches in 2010 were full of people experiencing pluralistic ignorance. Teenagers who doubted but assumed they were the only ones. Young adults who'd stopped believing but kept attending for social reasons. Parents who were less certain than they pretended. Social media shattered pluralistic ignorance because it allowed people to signal their true beliefs anonymously or to distant audiences. A teenager could post something doubting Christianity on Tumblr and get validation from thousands of people overnight. Suddenly you realized you weren't alone. The pastors I've interviewed about this period describe it like watching a dam break. One megachurch pastor in Georgia told me that in 2011 his church had 800 college-age members. By 2014, it was down to 200. It was like they all decided at once, and he said, one week they were there, the next week they weren't. What happened was they'd all been quietly doubting for years, but seeing each other express those doubts online gave them permission to act on it. Now, let's talk about what happened to the communities themselves, because this is where the story gets really dark. Remember, the Bible Belt Church wasn't just a place you went on Sunday. It was the organizing principle of social life. In a town of 5,000 people in Oklahoma in 2005, if you wanted to meet people, you went to church. If you wanted to date, you met people at church. If you needed help moving, you asked people from church. If you were starting a business, your first customers came from church. The church wasn't just a religious institution, it was the social infrastructure. When that infrastructure collapsed, it didn't get replaced. There was no backup system. By 2018, sociologists were documenting what they called friendship recession in former Bible Belt strongholds. Americans, on average, had fewer close friends than at any point since data collection began in 1990. But the drop was sharpest in Bible Belt communities. A study from the Survey Center on American Life found that in 2020, 15% of American men reported having zero close friends. In Bible Belt states specifically, that number was 22%. Women fared slightly better but showed the same geographic pattern. Here's a story that illustrates this perfectly. In 2017, a man in Alabama named Tom Jenkins started a Facebook group called Thursday Night Poker, No Church People. The name was a joke, sort of. He'd left his church 2 years earlier and realized he had no friends outside of it. None. At age 43, he was socially isolated. The poker group was his attempt to build a new social circle. It worked. Within 6 months, 35 guys were showing up every Thursday. But here's the haunting part. When a local journalist interviewed the members in 2019, 28 of the 35 said they'd left churches within the past 5 years. And 19 of them said the poker group was the only regular social contact they had outside of work. They'd escaped the church but found themselves in social poverty. The political ramifications have been absolutely wild, And this is where things get controversial. There's a paradox that confuses a lot of people. If the Bible Belt was declining, why did it seem to get more politically radical after 2012? Why did white evangelical Christians become more politically mobilized, more partisan, more extreme? The answer is actually straightforward. It's the last stand. When a majority becomes a minority, it often becomes more militant, not less. In 2012, white evangelical Protestants were 31% of the American population. By 2020, they were 14%. That's a 55% decline in relative population share in just 8 years. Political scientists call this defensive minoritization, and it follows a predictable pattern. The remaining members of a shrinking group become more ideologically committed, more politically active, and more willing to embrace extreme measures to maintain power. You saw this with apartheid in South Africa, with Sunnis in Iraq after 2003, with white Southerners during Reconstruction. When you're losing demographic dominance, politics becomes existential. Here's the data that proves it. In 2006, 63% of white evangelicals said they were Republican or leaning Republican. By 2020, that number was 84%. But the total number of white evangelicals was dropping rapidly, so you had a smaller group becoming more politically concentrated. Meanwhile, the people leaving weren't becoming Republicans. A 2019 study found that Americans who left evangelical churches were twice as likely to identify as Democrats or independents as the general population. So you ended up with this strange situation where Bible Belt communities were simultaneously becoming less religious and more politically conservative. The people who stayed in churches became more politically activated. The people who left mostly moved to cities or suburbs, creating geographic sorting. By 2020, there were entire counties in the South where church attendance had dropped by 30% in a decade, but Republican vote share had increased. This created a doom loop for churches. As congregations became more politically homogeneous, they became more politically vocal. As they became more politically vocal, they alienated the remaining moderates, who left, which made the remaining congregation more extreme, which alienated more moderates. By 2019, 54% of Americans who'd left churches in the previous 5 years cited too much focus on politics as a major reason. In the South specifically, that number was 68%. Let me give you a specific example. There's a Baptist church in Tennessee that had 1,200 members in 2010. In 2015, the pastor started preaching explicitly political sermons, not occasional references to politics, full-on political endorsements from the pulpit. By 2017, the church was down to 800 members. By 2020, 400. The pastor interpreted this as evidence that the culture was becoming hostile to Christianity. But exit interviews with former members told a different story. 73% said they left because they felt the church had become a political organization rather than a spiritual one. The pastor's response to decline was to double down on the politics, which accelerated the decline. Now, here's the thing that should keep you up at night. We're only at the beginning of this process. The generational wave hasn't fully hit yet. Americans over 65 still attend church at much higher rates than younger Americans. In 2020, 49% of Americans over 65 attended church at least monthly. Only 19% of Americans under 30 did, but the over 65 population is going to decline sharply over the next 20 years as baby boomers age out. Meanwhile, the under 30 population of 2020 will become the under 50 population of 2040, bringing their low religiosity with them. Demographers have run the projections, and they're stark. If current trends continue by 2040, weekly church attendance in the United States will be around 12%. In Bible Belt states specifically, probably around 18%. For context, that would make America less religious than France, less religious than the Czech Republic, less religious than every Western European nation except Sweden. The Bible Belt as a cultural force will simply cease to exist. But there's a deeper question here, and it's one that most people miss. What actually held the Bible Belt together in the first place? It wasn't theology. Most people in Bible Belt communities in 1960 couldn't explain basic Christian doctrine if you asked them. It wasn't biblical literacy. Studies consistently showed that regular churchgoers knew less about the Bible than they thought. What held it together was social pressure plus information control. You went to church because everyone else went to church, and you didn't question it because you had no access to alternative frameworks. The internet didn't make people stop believing in God. Plenty of atheists existed in Bible Belt communities in 1960. They just kept quiet about it. What the internet did was remove the social cost of unbelief by showing people that millions of others had already paid that cost and were fine. It removed the information control by providing unlimited access to alternative ideas. Once those two factors disappeared, the whole system collapsed, and it collapsed fast because it was never as strong as it looked. Here's the parallel that historians will draw 100 years from now. The Bible Belt collapse mirrors the collapse of Soviet communism in almost eerie ways. Soviet communism looked powerful in 1985. The USSR had nuclear weapons, a massive military, control over 14 time zones. But it was a facade. The system only worked because of information control and social pressure. When Gorbachev loosened information control through glasnost, the whole thing collapsed in about 3 years. The Bible Belt in 2007 looked powerful. Megachurches, political influence, cultural dominance. But it was also a facade held together by information control and social pressure. When smartphones broke the information monopoly, collapse followed within a decade. Now, what happens next is genuinely unpredictable. Some researchers think we're headed for European-style secularism, where religion becomes a private, mostly irrelevant part of life. Others think we're headed for polarization, where 40% of the country becomes intensely secular and 40% becomes intensely religious, with almost no middle ground. The data from the past 5 years suggests polarization is winning. Church attendance overall is dropping, but among people who still attend, frequency is increasing. You have fewer Christians, but they're more committed. There's also a wild card nobody's really talking about. What happens to the physical infrastructure? There are over 300,000 churches in the United States. Most of them are in the South. Most of them were built between 1950 and 1990. As congregations shrink and close, what happens to all those buildings? Some get converted to breweries or climbing gyms. Some get demolished. But in small towns with declining populations, many just sit empty. By 2030, there will be tens of thousands of abandoned church buildings across the Bible Belt, physical monuments to a collapsed social order. And here's the economic angle that people really underestimate. The Bible Belt's economy was substantially built on church-related spending. Christian bookstores, Christian music labels, Christian camps and retreat centers, Christian schools, religious publishing, church construction, pastoral salaries. In 2005, the Christian industrial complex was worth an estimated $40 billion annually. By 2020, it was worth about $18 billion and dropping fast. Entire towns in the South had economies centered on church conferences and religious tourism. Those economies are cratering. There's a town in Missouri that had a Christian conference center that hosted 60,000 visitors a year. Those visitors spent money at local restaurants, hotels, shops. The conference center closed in 2018 due to declining attendance. Within 2 years, 11 local businesses had closed. The town's population dropped by 14%. This pattern is repeating across the Bible Belt. The economic collapse of religious infrastructure is creating a secondary economic crisis in communities that were already struggling. But let me end with the human element, because that's what really matters. I've spent 3 years interviewing people across the South about this transition, and the stories are heartbreaking on all sides. I talked to an 80-year-old woman in Arkansas whose church of 400 members is down to 40. She goes every Sunday and sits in a sanctuary built for 400, mostly empty. She told me, "I don't understand what happened. We did everything right. We taught them the word, and they just left."